Because you're back in the world, Doctor.
I'm back, I love it. I've been so much I couldn't say, don't tell me off.
No, I'm not telling you off.
You once interviewed me about Doctor Who, and his eyes glazed over, and he took a deep breath, and then he took this deep sigh, and he went, that's all very well, come on, something real.
If you watched a video I put out at the end of March, I detailed some ideas I had on how Russell T Davies could make some necessary changes to how Doctor Who presents itself to hopefully solve a few controversies that the show has had recently. And since then, the bar has actually been rising in terms of episode quality, with both Lux and The Well proving to be very successful, and have been dubbed by some fans a return to form, especially considering the massive twist with The Well, which I won't spoil. Now, when it comes to a show as unique as Doctor Who, everyone has their own way of doing things. Russell T Davies channeled his inner fanboy the first time around, Stephen Moffat played with time travel a lot more, and Chris Chibnall, well, there's a lot that can be said about his run on the show especially. Anyway, following the larger overall success of my DCU series, I have had many ideas for what the next larger scale series I could make based on that format, and after some writing, some Photoshop work, and a lot of brainstorming, I have finally come up with an idea. I present to you my vision as showrunner for Doctor Who. So, I know a lot of you must be asking, why would I want to provide my own vision for Doctor Who when I'm already working on an animated reboot that more or less serves the same purpose? That's because I have instead decided to rework some of the plans I had for that animation series into this. So the animation itself serves as more of a proof of concept, but I'm going to be making a few changes and presenting my ideas in this format instead. Whilst I do love animation and I'm still going to be working on that kind of stuff in future, I think for Doctor Who this is more of a better format and is a bit more comfortable for me. Another question I'm sure you all have is, why Doctor Who? Why not do a pitch for a Marvel universe, or better yet another beloved franchise? Well, there are a few reasons for that, the first being that Marvel is its own behemoth, and trying to pull off a universe pitch in that manner, for me at least, would be practically impossible. I'll have a lot of respect for anyone who tries to do it, especially if Super Frame tries his hand at pulling it off. Definitely seems like he's heading in that direction especially. The second reason for doing a Doctor Who pitch is because I've been a fan of Who for much longer than I've been a fan of Marvel and the superhero genre. I got into Doctor Who around 2010 to 2011, when Matt Smith was still flying around with Karen Gillan and Arthur Darvill. And I got into Marvel and comic books overall around 2013 to 2014, when Captain America the Winter Soldier and the first Guardians movie came out. But before that, Doctor Who was my thing, and definitely still is. Now, regarding my take on Doctor Who, I know a lot of you are going to be asking, what's the plan? Well, it's going to be similar to my DCU series, except things are going to be slightly changed up. Firstly, this is being done in more of a TV format, so we're not headed to the big screen for anything, sadly. Whilst I'm sure a Doctor Who film would do amazingly with the right creative team behind it, I'm just going to focus on Who as a TV series for now, because, again, a film is its own behemoth. Anyway, my plan is to tell a story for the Doctor across a 5-series arc, with each one featuring an iconic villain from the Whoniverse. Regarding the format, there are loads of options we can go down. The original 13-episode format, for me, is a little too much and very overpowering in some regards. And the same goes for the 12 and 10 episode formats that Moffat and later Chibnall used. An 8-episode runtime is good and definitely a step in the right direction, since a lot of streaming shows like The Mandalorian have used that same runtime. But for me, I'm actually going to take a page out of Chris Chibnall's book, I know, quite bizarre, and actually do a 6-episode format, similar to what he did with Doctor Who Flux, not willingly, and reintroduce the more serialised format that the classic series used. So each series will be one story told over the course of 6 episodes, with all of them feeding into the narrative. So the first question for me is, who will be the Doctor? Well, you've already seen it on the thumbnail, but my choice for the Doctor in this series is none other than Andrew Lincoln. Best known for his outstanding work as Rick Grimes in AMC's The Walking Dead and his recent spin-off The Ones Who Live, Andrew in my mind has what it takes to play a more complex and more experienced Doctor. Now, Andrew has been my top choice to play the Doctor for a long time now. In fact, he was my number one choice to take on the role after Jodie Whittaker's departure, and whilst I am disappointed he didn't take on the role, I think both David Tennant and Ncuti Gatwa have done terrific jobs in this new era. With the Doctor cast, how exactly will the regeneration be handled? Well, there's quite a long answer to that, so let me do a bit of explaining. Now, the general consensus amongst the Whovian masses at the moment is that Ncuti Gatwa might actually be leaving at the end of Season 2, due to him currently being busy with some upcoming stage work which may limit any plans for him being in Season 3 if he isn't leaving. Regarding the transition between Doctors, I think it's much more likely that we won't find out who the next Doctor is because the regeneration will be left somewhat open-ended, which gives Russell and the Bad Wolf crew some time to find a new Doctor if they haven't had time to cast one yet. Now, the next part of this series is The Companion, which I actually have a few in-depth thoughts on. Now, one of the large complaints regarding most of the Who companions is that they're all from contemporary Earth. Rose Tyler, Martha Jones, Donna Noble, Amy and Rory, Clara, Bill Potts, Yaz, Ryan and Graham. Yes, a lot of them are very well received, with Martha, Amy and Clara being my top 3 favourites. I think it's time we had a return to either non-human or non-contemporary companions. If you look at the classic series, we had characters such as Leela, Romana, Turlo, Adric and Nyssa. They may have all looked human, yes, but they were all from different periods in time or other planets entirely. We know that to be the case with a lot in this situation. And we've even had a few android/robot companions, with both K9 and Chameleon coming instantly to mind in those regards. With all that being said, here's what I would do and I'm going to do for my series. My 2 companions starting off are Charlie Edwards and a returning classic companion, Chameleon. Charlie is from the time period we'll be exploring for the first season, the future of 2049, which has become a technological haven thanks to the Hexagon Corporation run by Arthur Tressman, who serves as the main antagonist for the series. Regarding the casting for Charlie, my ideal choice is Nathalie Emmanuel. Widely known for her roles in both Game of Thrones and the Fast and Furious films, Nathalie, in my opinion, has the overall vibe I'd want from a character like Charlie, especially when you watch her as Ramsey in the Fast and Furious movies, which is what made me cast her as the companion for this. And regarding Chameleon, he's a little different obviously. Now, whilst we could get an actor to stand in as the actual android, my take on the character is fully a cyborg and shares a few characteristics with the Sharkiverse variant of the Master. That being he's an android specifically designed to pilot the TARDIS and is confined to the ship. So in my mind, I think you'd have to get a voice actor in to play Chameleon, but that's currently my take on it. Okay, with the Doctor and the companions fully discussed, let's talk about the villain for this story, Arthur Tressman, the CEO of the Hexagon Corporation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, each season of my take on Who will have a classic villain from the wider Who universe playing a larger role, and in this case, Arthur Tressman is in fact the Master. Now, in the 60th anniversary specials, it's actually mentioned in passing that the Master had an unseen encounter with the Toymaker, likely in the time after Power of the Doctor. This encounter resulted in the Master himself being shrunken inside a golden tooth. However, I find it more than likely that the Moriarty to the Doctor's Sherlock will definitely be returning in future, and with that being said, I've got the perfect casting idea in mind, and that is Toby Alexander Smith. For those who don't know, Toby is perhaps best known nowadays for his portrayal as Grey Atkins in EastEnders from 2019 to around 2022. As a villain, Grey was just completely evil. He abused his wife and killed 3 people, not to mention several other crimes in that time as well. And it was the time after Power of the Doctor that I thought Toby would be a terrific choice to play the Master when he next appears. Regarding how that regeneration from Dewan to the next Master could be done, I think it would have to happen after the events of Season 2, the Master getting released from the Golden Tooth but still in his Dewan incarnation, and on the verge of dying ends up by generating, as we saw with the Doctor in the 60th specials, and the new Master kills his predecessor, which we have seen before. Now, regarding the actual series itself, here's the plan. As mentioned earlier, we're aiming for around 6 episodes as per Flux and Classic Who, with the series spanning one whole story. So these episodes are titled as follows and in order: Mastery of Technology, Bonnie and Clyde, Absolute Power, You Will Obey Me, Darkest Mind, and Breakdown. And these all follow a somewhat basic structure. I think each episode I'd like to have maybe 45 minutes in length, so I think that's what most of the Who episodes have been aiming for recently. So, episode 1 is a similar, tonally speaking, to Rose, where we meet Charlie and spend time with her before she meets the Doctor, and then following an encounter with the villain, ends up running to the Doctor for help in the end. Episode 2 continues on from there, with the Doctor and Charlie actually meeting with the Master currently under the Arthur Tressman disguise. Episode 3 picks up a week later with the Doctor, Charlie and quote-unquote Tressman working on building an android pilot for the crashed TARDIS. However, whilst this android is completed and becomes the new body for Chameleon, he is the one to reveal that Tressman is in fact the Master. Then episode 4 deals with the aftermath of this reveal, with the Master using his influence to declare the Doctor and Charlie as wanted fugitives, forcing the duo to take their TARDIS and flee Earth. Episode 5 is a filler episode and takes the Doctor and Charlie to a planetary shipyard, where they meet a crime boss that runs the territory here, eventually striking a deal to find out some information he has on the Master and the security drones he plans to build from Chameleon's blueprints. Episode 6, the finale, ends the story and sees Doctor and Charlie forced into a corner by the Master, with the threat of death and the Doctor losing his remaining regeneration, something the Master plans to do without his cooperation. The episode ends with the Master himself being imprisoned in Unit Tower in the present day of, well, modern day really when this would air, and Charlie then joining the Doctor for another adventure, and it's one the two of them are sure not to forget. So, with the Master being the villain for Season 1 and him being sort of incapacitated by the finale, who's the villain for Season 2? Well, that's a very good question that I'm sure some of you may have picked up if you stayed for the tease at the end of Season 1. The story for Season 2 will see the Doctor and Charlie getting involved in the final days of the Cyber Wars, which of course means our villains will be the Cybermen. So for those who don't know, the Cyber Wars was one of the many galactic conflicts from the wider universe that we haven't really seen fully play out on screen. Whilst we have seen events after it, like with Ascension of the Cybermen, think of it like the Time War or the Sontaran Rutan War, where you've heard all these things about the conflict, but never have we fully seen it play out on screen. Though in the case of the Time War we do have Big Finish, and I think we're getting that with the Sontaran/Rutan War. That might have happened already, I don't know. But the Cyber Wars have not had that luxury, at least not yet. Now, using the Cybermen for Season 2 is going to be different than what we've seen before, as I'm going to be utilising a few different variants of the villains. The first variant that is more predominantly seen throughout the story will be the Lumic/Cyber Cybermen, from Modern Who, and sadly were replaced by the Nightmare and Silver design during Series 7 and the Ascension/Cybermaster designs in Series 12. The second type of Cybermen I will be using is the Cyber Commander. Now, for those who don't know, the Cyber Commander is a design that we've never actually seen before in the Whoniverse in live action, and that's because the plans to use it initially were scrapped completely. The Cyber Commander design was planned to be used in the 90s as part of a direct-to-video movie to celebrate Doctor Who's, at the time, 30th anniversary in 1993. It would have featured Doctors 3 through 7 alongside a few companions taking on a villain made of chronal energy, and explores an alternate timeline where the Fourth Doctor himself never died from the Faros project in Logopolis, leading to the erasure of all his future incarnations. And finally, the last type of Cyberman is actually a new one I've made specifically for this series. These Cybermen are zombified humans, and the story behind them is that the conversion process, during it, the emotional inhibitors weren't installed properly and turned the resulting subjects of the conversion into almost zombified and mindless creatures. Moving on to some character details now, we'll start with the Doctor, as there are quite a few developments with his character in this season that I would like to fully discuss. When he and Charlie land on Earth during the conflict, the Doctor works with the main leader of this group, who actually turns out to be a descendant of the Brigadier and Kate Stewart. Eventually, however, a Cyberman attack results in the death of the Brigadier's descendant and leaves this resistance now without a leader. In the aftermath, the Doctor rallies together the remaining members of the Resistance and has no choice but to embrace a role that he once held in contempt for a very long time. It's time for him to become the Doctor of War once again. The third episode of this series for me is where we see the Doctor at his best, I think, determined to make it off this abandoned cyber carrier before these zombified Cybermen can convert him and Charlie into these undead monsters. However, this experience, combined with who he becomes during this conflict, leads to Charlie not wanting to travel with the Doctor anymore, and she leaves him for good. This season is what sets up the Doctor's next arc going into Season 3, and that's how far he's willing to go to save the world from a catastrophic threat. That then brings us to Charlie, who we met in Season 1 and joined the Doctor aboard the TARDIS alongside Chameleon. Now, as mentioned, this season will see Charlie depart the TARDIS for a few reasons. The first one being, it's the overall impact of the Cyber Wars and seeing what this kind of conflict does to people. The second reason is that she sees what kind of impact this conflict specifically has on the Doctor, and while she doesn't know what kind of impact the Time War had because her time period is in a quote-unquote post-war future from the Doctor's perspective, the events of this series for her gets to the point where she says enough is enough, and she leaves on very bad terms with the Doctor, And that in of itself is actually very rare, because whilst we've seen companions depart on either good terms with the Doctor or they left unwillingly, we've never, to my knowledge at least, seen a long-term companion of the Doctor leave the TARDIS on bad terms in any way. I don't really count Adam Mitchell in that for obvious reasons, since he was only in 2 stories on screen. And in this case we're only sticking to the TV series. Expanded media is a whole other can of worms. But a companion departing on bad terms is something that I always got curious about, and it's something I wanted to try and incorporate into my take on the show in some way. Now I'm going to very quickly go into some new characters and who will be playing them in this season. The first one of course is the descendant of the Brigadier, Lieutenant Thomas Alderman Lethbridge Stewart. Thomas grew up hearing stories of the Doctor from the unit archives and is honoured to be meeting the very legend himself. We've seen the Doctor have a relationship with UNIT in many forms over the years, but I've always wondered what that would look like at this point in time. And whilst Kate and the modern version of UNIT will be appearing a bit further down the line, I wanted to explore the far future for a bit before we take things a little more grounded with seasons 3 and 4, but I will of course save those stories for their respective videos. Regarding whom could play this descendant of the Brigadier in the story, I didn't initially think about using Max Bowden because he can pull off a mustache, though I've used him before in season 1 as Tamura Lawton, so for that I would want an unknown actor of some variety perhaps to take on the role. The second companion is sort of a temporary one for this season, Ezekiel Shaw. Now Ezekiel is a character that's had roots in my Doctor Who work for a while now. Although not seen on the channel, a while ago I was working on a project called Doctor Who Concepts, which would have paired Doctors with companions facing off against a master, with each one having a different subgenre of sci-fi to it. The first story, which became the proof of concept for my Doctor Who reboot, was initially conceived as a quote-unquote cyberpunk story, as we see the Doctor regenerate and then meeting Charlie, and it's also worth noting that each story would have had an Elseworlds quality to it. So the Lincoln Doctor would have followed an alternate timeline established from the Time War, where instead of fleeing the war and turning himself human, the Master actually worked with the Doctor in an effort to try and end the war himself. Anyway, Ezekiel in this season will be portrayed by Lenny James, perhaps known for a lot of things including his work in Line of Duty, Snatch, or of course The Walking Dead and its spin-off Fear the Walking Dead. Lenny for me possesses a lot of the qualities I would want the actor to play Ezekiel, and it's why I've cast him in this story, more or less. And now moving on to the overall outline for the season and its episodes. If you want to see a more detailed breakdown, then you can head to the Google document in the description below, where you'll find a lot more information on the story overall. So episode 1 is the introduction to the landscape that we'll be focusing on. We briefly recap the events of season 1 before catching up with the Doctor and Charlie in the present day of the story. This takes us into the rest of the episode, where the Doctor and Charlie herself land in one of the many battlefields of the Cyber Wars, and after the death of the Resistance leader, the Doctor is forced to embrace his role as the Doctor of War once again. Episode 2 then drops us further into the conflict and introduces us to Ezekiel Shaw, who becomes something of a confidant for the Doctor, quite appropriate considering he's a vicar. We see the Doctor confide in Ezekiel about the Time War and the choices he was forced to make during that difficult period in his life. Charlie gets a subplot in this episode where she discovers blueprints for the Cyber Commander and delivers them to the Resistance, and the episode ending with the discovery of an abandoned cyber ship on the edge of the galaxy. Episode 3 follows up on that ending, as we see the Doctor and Charlie land on that ship with the TARDIS and Chameleon, discovering the horrifying truth about the members of the crew on board. The episode is similar to Wild Blue Yonder, except the shapeshifters have been replaced by zombified Cybermen, and there's more than 2 of them. Episode 4 would take us back to the battlefield as the Doctor and Charlie return, scarred from the events of the previous episode. This would see the official debut of the Cyber Commander, a more skeletal variant of the basic Cyberman design, containing blades in its arms as opposed to a laser cannon. The end of the episode would see the discovery of the Cyber Controller, who's been controlling this group of Cybermen during the series thus far. Episode 5, the penultimate episode, would bring us the reveal of this entire group of Cybermen being connected by a hive mind, which in turn is connected to the Cyber Controller. The episode itself ends with the Resistance and the Doctor discovering the new weapon that the Cybermen have been constructing, a deadly nuclear device with the intent of using it to wipe out the remainder of humanity on Earth. And that of course brings us to the finale of the series, not only with the defeat of the Cybermen and the sacrifice of Ezekiel, but also the departure of Charlie from the TARDIS, as she can no longer watch the Doctor go down the path he's allowed himself to follow. We end the finale and this season of the show on the shot of the Doctor looking in the mirror as she wonders, how far will he go to protect the universe? So, with Charlie gone, the Cybermen destroyed and the Doctor in a fairly neutral place, what's next for the story going forward? Well, for Season 3 we're taking things to a more fantastical level, even though Russell's already done that, and this season we'll see the Doctor facing off against his one true nemesis, the Daleks. More specifically, the Doctor finds himself in a race to the lost city of Atlantis against the Daleks to stop them from acquiring technology from the lost city to rebuild the Dalek Empire. So I'm going to start off first with the Doctor, as he goes through quite a monumental change over the course of Season 3. Now, at the end of Season 2, Charlie leaves the Doctor due to him willing to let both her and Ezekiel die to the Cybermen in order to stop the war, and she doesn't want to travel with the Doctor if this is what a large-scale conflict will do to him. Charlie's departure inspires the Doctor to be a better person, and it does work when he meets his new companion, which I'll come back to in just a moment. Now, the Doctor finds himself locked in a battle with our villains for Season 3 as he is put in a race against them to find Atlantis. Another point I'm bringing up about the Doctor is that this will be the last season to feature Andrew Lincoln as the character, as his final battle with the villains in this season will lead to his regeneration into a new incarnation. Okay, so that then brings us to our new companion for Season 3, what with Charlie departing the TARDIS, leaving the Doctor alone with Chameleon, who was built in a way so that he's confined to the control room, similar to the Shouker Master, which I mentioned in my Season 1 video. Okay, so that brings us to introducing our new companion, Daisy Warren. So, Daisy is the Doctor's companion from here on out, travelling with him throughout Seasons 3 to 5. Now, Daisy specifically is from the past, more specifically she's from the 1980s. One thing I actually mentioned in a previous entry in the series is that I was frustrated with companions mostly being from modern day Earth, at least when it came to the modern run on Who from 2005 onwards, and I wanted to do something different with my companions specifically, that being they're not from contemporary time periods, so that being they're not from the present day, and Daisy is another example of what I was going for. An aspiring deaf writer, Daisy encounters the Doctor by chance when she's working on her new fantasy novel, The Call of Atlantis, about an archaeologist who seeks to find the sunken city. Now, when I was conceptualizing the character of Daisy, I wanted more of a contrast to the character of Charlie, who was a tough streetwise companion from the future, and I kept that in mind when casting the character because my choice for Daisy is Rose Ayling-Ellis. Now, Rose in the past 5 years has become a household name, having played Frankie Lewis in EastEnders for around 3 years, and then going on to start in the new ITV drama Code of Silence, and whilst I am yet to watch the latter, it was actually Rose's work on EastEnders that made me want to cast her as a companion, as I've been a follower of that soap for quite a few years. Now, I am aware that Rose was in a recent episode of Who, however, this is a different time period as opposed to the far future when we saw her character, so I would say this casting can still fit into the timeline. In fact, if we were to actually fit this into the narrative canon, I think the Doctor could actually take some comfort in seeing a face that he recognises, even though the face doesn't recognise him, because it's someone completely different to him. Okay, that then brings us to our villains for Season 3, the Daleks, and more specifically what I'll be doing with them for this season. Now, originally, I did consider filling a gap in the timeline and have the Daleks in this series be a group of renegades that survived the events of Remembrance. However, I instead decided to head a bit later in the timeline and have this be a group of Daleks from after Series 9 of Modern Who, that survived the collapse of the main Skaro city and fled in a decommissioned Dalek saucer, sort of a parallel to how the first Doctor and Susan fled in a decommissioned TARDIS way at the start of the entire Who timeline. Now, the group of Daleks in the story plan to find Atlantis, believing it to contain enhanced technology that they can use to repair Skaro and restore the Dalek Empire. Now, another element of the classic run I'm bringing back is the use of different weapon attachments in place of the plunger arm. Over the years, we've seen the Daleks using some kind of tool in place of the usual plunger attachment, whether it be a claw arm as seen in Parting of the Ways, a flamethrower as seen in the Daleks' Master Plan, or the mutant scoop from Power of the Daleks. Now, in Season 3, one of the Daleks is fitted with a seismic detector, which doesn't really serve the same purpose that it did in the classic run. In the classic Who episode The Chase, the Daleks use a seismic detector to track the TARDIS. However, this updated version instead tracks the seismic activity of earthquakes, which becomes of use to them in the story, as you'll find out. Okay, as a quick side note before I move on to all the story related details, I just wanted to add that I'm not using the Time War design from Modern Who in regards to the Daleks. Instead, I'm actually using a more updated version of the Renegade design from Classic Who. There's going to be a photo on screen now to show what the design for the Daleks is going to be in Season 3. Okay, so this then brings us to the story for Season 3 and how this encounter with the Daleks in a race for Atlantis is going to play out. Okay, so Episode 1 is going to serve as the introduction to our new companion Daisy as she researches some books for her fantasy novel about an archaeologist seeking to find Atlantis. After translating some Atlantean language and reading it aloud, it triggers an earthquake and we then cut to the Doctor and follow his point of view for a moment. Regarding how long it's been for the Doctor since Season 2, it has been a couple of months since those events and when Charlie left the TARDIS, at least from his perspective. Now, the Doctor has been travelling on his own since Charlie left him with only Chameleon for company, who acts mainly as a pilot for the TARDIS and cannot accompany the Doctor outside of it. Eventually, the Doctor detects some seismic activity in 1980s Cardiff, which attracts his attention, and he makes his way to the time period. Now, a bulk of the series does take place in Cardiff, and when the Doctor lands in the 80s version of the Welsh town, he does make an effort to try and avoid the Torchwood hub, as he knows that a previous version of Captain Jack is stationed there before his reunion with the 10th Doctor in Utopia, and doesn't really want to cause any damage to the timeline and what have you. The earthquake brings the Doctor and Daisy into each other's past, and the two realise they have a common goal. Daisy then tells the Doctor about herself, that she's an aspiring writer and wants to write a new fantasy book about Atlantis. As a quick note here, because I think this is kind of obvious to sort of address, Rose Ellis, who I've cast as Daisy, is deaf in real life, and I carried that over with Daisy, so I think the Doctor would possibly learn some form of sign language to communicate with her. And I'd like to think that perhaps later on in the story, the Doctor will actually give Daisy a pair of advanced hearing aids that he's created so that they can understand each other properly. So the Doctor admires what Daisy is doing, but after reading the transcripts that she took from the library to use for research, the Doctor realises that when Daisy read the Atlantean language when it was translated into English, that was what triggered the seismic shift underground, and the cliffhanger for episode 1 would be the arrival of the Daleks and their interest in finding Atlantis. Episode 2 would be where the Doctor confronts the Daleks, and here we discover that these versions of the titular villains are survivors from the events of Series 9, and reveal that they plan to steal the technology they believe is still hidden in the Lost City to repair Skaro. The Doctor and Daisy escape the Daleks and return to the TARDIS, now determined to find the Lost City as well and prevent the Atlantean technology from falling into the wrong hands. Episode 3 will then pick up a few days later. The Doctor and Daisy has spent their time tracking the Dalek ship, which has remained in the vortex for those few days. I want to make clear, because in extension to my point earlier, this would be in the period where the Doctor gives Daisy the advanced hearing aids that I just mentioned. The duo catches a break and sees the Daleks land on Earth approximately a decade later in the 90s. Returning to the earthquake spot in Cardiff, the Doctor confirms his suspicion that the translated Atlantean passage spoken by Daisy was a method of trying to bring the kingdom back to the surface. I'd also make the retcon of the Doctor having visited Atlantis in its prime, previously in his 8th incarnation when he was travelling with Lucy Miller. So if this story was made as a series, then Paul McGann and Sheridan Smith would appear through a short flashback. The Daleks arrive, killing a few civilians, which causes the Doctor and Daisy to retreat. However, this was a ruse, as the Doctor has figured out a way to properly track the position of Atlantis beneath the Earth's crust. After some tinkering, the Doctor manages to construct a ground sonar device that he can wire to the TARDIS and use to locate wherever Atlantis is hidden beneath the Earth. Back on their ship, the Daleks are also using their seismic detection controls, managed to locate the source of the Lost Kingdom as well. Episode 4 would be where both parties discover Atlantis. The Doctor and Daisy look around, and after translating another passage of Atlantean language, Daisy speaks it aloud, which in turn causes another small earthquake, leading the Daleks to the Lost Kingdom as well. This would then bring us onto the penultimate episode, as we get more backstory on Atlantis and how the kingdom came to be. It was founded by a pantheon of Atlantean gods, these being Oceanus, Prometheus, Leto, Hyperion, Thea, and Atlas. Eventually these gods fell and Atlan became the true ruler, bringing the kingdom to a new age of prosperity. After exploring Atlantis a little further, the Doctor and Daisy come across a vast chasm, and after looking at the nature of this chasm itself, the Doctor realises that this is what truly caused the collapse of Atlantis. The shifting of the Earth is what caused Atlantis to fall, and the shifting land in turn resulted in an earthquake which caused the total collapse of the kingdom, sending it beneath Earth. The only detail the Doctor is unable to reconcile at this point is what happened to Atlan, because with the collapse of the kingdom having been determined, the fate of the Atlantean ruler remains the only missing piece of this puzzle. That then brings us onto the finale, where the Doctor discovers that the fate of Atlan and the collapse of Atlantis are linked. Atlan was the one to overthrow the pantheon of gods and take the throne for himself. Several thousand years later, Atlan's rule came to an end when the Pantheon, now filled with vengeance, returned from heaven and punished Atlan himself by killing him, and as punishment, sent Atlantis to the underground, the seismic shift killing the remaining occupants of the Lost City. The Daleks would arrive believing that Atlan was the key to discovering the source of Atlantis' power, and in doing so also exterminate the Doctor. Opening Atlan's tomb, however, triggers a massive earthquake which causes the kingdom to begin crumbling. The Doctor and Daisy would escape to the TARDIS whilst the Daleks are destroyed and buried beneath the Lost Kingdom's rubble, now lost to time forever. Back in the TARDIS, Chameleon is piloting the controls as the Doctor recuperates, and Daisy is sat by him, hoping that he's okay. The Doctor gets to his feet, saying it was never supposed to end like this, and Daisy's confused, but the Chameleon steps in. The Doctor looks to Daisy and smiles. He regenerates into his next incarnation.